Good to go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the Jameel Index for Food Trade and Vulnerability Forum, titled Food Trade in the Current Age of Uncertainty, looking at the new era in global food trade through the lens of the BRICS trade bloc. I'm Greg Sixt from the MIT's Abdul Latif Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, where I lead the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, or FACT Alliance, a global network of research institutions, of over 20 research institutions, focused on integrative applied research for solving vexing food and climate systems challenges. And this is one of the FACT Alliance projects, the foundational FACT Alliance project. So I'm really pleased to welcome you here today. We've got a great group of speakers and a great panel. First, I'm pleased to introduce our host and our colleague and partner on the project, Sir Professor Charles Godfray. He's Professor of Population Biology at Balliol College here at Oxford, Director of the Oxford Martin School, and Director of the Oxford Martin Program on the Future of Food. He's a population biologist with broad interest in environmental sciences and has published in fundamental and applied areas of ecology, evolution, and epidemiology. Charles?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Oxford Martin School. Just before talking about the Jameel Index, let me just say a few words about where you are and what the Martin School is. So the building that you're in at the moment, it's called the Old India Institute. It was built in the middle of the 19th century to host everything that the university did associated with the Indian subcontinent, which in those days was part of the British Empire. And the room that you're in at the moment was a collection of Indian art, which has now been moved to the Ashmolean Museum, a wonderful museum on the other side of town, which do get a chance to go to if you have time. And not for the first time for the university, something was set up with a sort of capital to build the building, but not with the sort of money to run it. And the Indian Institute, it sort of existed for about 80 years, and then it sort of ran out of steam and was incorporated into different parts of the university. And this became the History Faculty's Library and the History Faculty Centre until 15 years ago, when we at the Martin School were lucky enough to be given the building by the university. So the Martin School is 20 years old, almost exactly. Next Thursday, a week the day after tomorrow, we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary. It was set up by James Martin, who was highly influential in the early days of the internet revolution and was a futurist, thinking about the future of the 21st century. He spent most of his career in the United States, sadly died around 10 years ago. But he'd been an undergraduate here at Oxford reading physics in the 1950s. And he looked at his old university, and we, like many universities, are sort of built on what might be called the 19th century German model, with an economics department, a physics department, a biology department, an English department. A model that has served us really well. But he asked, is it really fit for purpose for the university addressing the major problems of the 21st century? And what was then in the biggest gift that the university had received, he endowed the Martin School and challenged us to bring together research within the university and working with our colleagues in other institutions to, as I say, address the major challenges of the 21st century. So what we try and do is we try and do things that the rest of the university can't do. We try and bring together people who would not otherwise work together. The university does wonderful fundamental research, but we are actually concentrating on research that has a plausible pathway to impact. We want to see a real impact along the way. And the way we largely do the research, we carry out a mission in two ways. First of all, we bring people together in this wonderful building. You'll see many on the web, many talks and various other events that are hosted here. But our main way of doing it is through programs, where we fund, typically for 3 years, a program for a group of researchers to work on a particular topic. And one of the topics that we have at the moment is a program on systemic resilience, which Ken and a few other people were involved with before the current project. And also a couple of programs which I've been very much involved in. One of the things I'm very interested in is food security and food strategy. And we have 2 programs on food data analytics and the future of food. So we're at the university, we really try and look out, we really see how we can facilitate work on these major challenges. And so that's why it's been the most enormous pleasure to be part of the J-WAFS program, and we're hugely grateful for Community Jameel for funding this. We're grateful for 2 reasons. First of all, the index that we're launching today, we think is really important. It's going to be very helpful for policymakers, and it tells us things that we just did not know beforehand. Greg said, we live in really concerning times at the moment. Certainly, if one goes back even 10 years ago, did you really think that 10 years from hence we'd have wars in Europe? What is happening in the Middle East at the moment? And to understand the resilience and the lack of resilience, especially in the field of food trade and vulnerability, is just so important. So we're grateful to Community Jameel for funding this research. And if I may say, we're at Oxford are particularly grateful for the opportunity to work with our colleagues at MIT, our colleagues at the International Food Policy Research Institute, with whom, and it's a shame that no one is here from IFPRI this afternoon. We've worked extensively with them in the past, and it's been wonderful to do that as well. And also to be part of the FACT Alliance that Greg said. So that's all I wanted to say. Let me thank Community Jameel again. Let me thank Greg, Ken, and all the team for facilitating what I think has been such a fun project.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for welcoming us here for this important launch event. I am now pleased to welcome Nader Diab to the podium and to thank him and the rest of Community Jameel for the support that has made this possible. Nader is the head of programs at Community Jameel, an independent global organization advancing science and learning for communities to thrive. Nader leads efforts to monitor and optimize Community Jameel's programs. He also engages policymakers and policy partners to achieve impact at scale. Nader, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to our guests online. I'll start by thanking the University of Oxford for hosting us today, Sir, Professor, and obviously happy 20th anniversary to the Oxford Martin School in 2 days, a bit early. Thank you for hosting us. Big thanks to IFPRI, J-WAFS, and the FACT Alliance for bringing us today together to launch and unveil the Jameel Index. At Community Jameel, we're proud to support the Jameel Index. We believe it is a vital tool to guide policymakers, researchers, and the private sector in navigating countries' exposure to shocks in trade on the basis of the 8 agricultural commodities modeled. The volume of trade in crops has more than doubled in the last 2 decades. The benefits of trade have come with growing dependencies, which have also brought more risks, more vulnerabilities, and an even more complicated supply chain that is even more largely exposed to these risks. And the tragic events currently unraveling in the Middle East are further testament to the fragility of these supply chain and trade routes. Although Jameel Index models vulnerability based on 8 commodities, it reveals a broader story about trade, about how trade impacts overall food security, but not also food security, but how it affects nutritional outcomes beyond those commodities it models so far, because I understand more is coming. To give you an example of the reverberating effects on supply chain on the basis of these 8 commodities, I'll give an example from my home country, Lebanon. Back in 2019, Lebanese foreign exchange reserve were depleted. The Lebanese pound went into a free fall against the US dollars, with terrible consequences for an import-dependent country like Lebanon. This obviously led to a hyperinflationary environment. The middle class was wiped out. Prices increased across the board. Back in my hometown, in the south of Lebanon, called in Arabic Sur, or in English Tyre, from its Roman port city Tyrium, I was a big supporter of a milk cooperative that where everything about the chain was local, including the packaging. And yet the price of that milk increased as much as imported products. Now, you might be wondering, why is he coming up with this example? Milk is not being imported here. How is that relevant? And yet, if you look closer, it is the Jameel Index is relevant, because while everything about the milk was local, because of Lebanon's challenging environment, grazing was not possible to produce milk in large quantities. So the cow's diet had to be supported with wheat and corn, two produce that Lebanon does not grow, which had to be imported. So the cooperative had to pool whatever Lebanese pounds it had, go on the private market, buy the US dollars in order to be able to import the food to feed the cows, which explains why the price of a locally produced product increased as much as the other products that were wholly imported. This example highlights how the Jameel Index reveals vulnerabilities beyond the 8 commodities modeled throughout the entire food system and affect what we can afford to put on our dining tables. When families can no longer afford fresh milk, the alternative is powdered milk. And powdered milk, throughout the drying process, many of the vitamins that cannot withstand heat are depleted, which means fewer nutritional values for the consumers. And here we're talking about the impact on nutrition of substituting one product. In times of crisis, we substitute a basket of products, which is what happens in Lebanon. So imagine now the effect on public health of substituting a large basket of products with fewer nutritional values. And this really illustrates the deep links between trade, food security, and nutrition. Just 3 months ago, I was at the Nutrition for Growth Summit in Paris that was convened by the French government and witnessed record-breaking pledges for nutrition. And trade was identified as a key action area in the fight against malnutrition. This recognition reflects a growing global understanding that nutrition, trade are intricately connected. So the Jameel Index sits at the heart of this conversation, providing policymakers with the evidence they need not only to safeguard trade routes, but also protect nutritional outcomes. If this tool is so important and indispensable, it is obviously because of the people that worked on it with hard work, passion, and dedication throughout 3 years. Dr. Greg Sixt, Professor Ken Strasbeck at J-WAFS, the teams at IFPRI, the University of Oxford, EIAR, UAE University, Colorado University Advisory Committee, and all the experts who helped refine its methodology. Did I forget anyone? I hope not. I apologize if I did. Obviously, I have to recognize here the work done by 2 of my colleagues, Nathaniel, Head of Product of Community Jameel, and Tim, Web Developers, who gave this beautiful research a public-facing platform, which you can access through the URL. Looking ahead, more is coming. This summer, I understand climate change scenarios. The Jameel Index will be upgraded. New insights into how a warming world will reshape the food trade dynamics. After the summer, we're all going to COP in Brazil, where food trade, food systems, and food security are back on the top of the agenda, and where we expect the Jameel Index to have a major role to play. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you again for being here today. I look forward to the conversations.
Thank you, Nader. I'm just going to close this. I'm now pleased to welcome our keynote speaker, my co-lead on the project, a dear friend and a mentor, Professor Ken Strasbeck, or Kenneth Strasbeck. Ken is an honorary research associate in the School of Geography and Environment here at Oxford. He's a climate, water, and food specialist at MIT's Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, a research scientist at the MIT Center for Sustainability, Science, and Strategy, a senior research fellow at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and professor emeritus at from the University of Colorado. Professor Stresbeck has over 50 years as a researcher and practitioner at the nexus of engineering, agriculture, and economic systems. Ken?
So thank you. Do I advance it here? Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. There we go. Okay. I don't know what I did. Thank you very much. We want to thank Community Jameel for their support on this project. And we also want to thank Charles for inviting me to be a visiting fellow here. And what Jim Martin wanted happened because of being here, being part of the Future of Food program and our linkage to MIT. We birthed this project and is bringing together science for policy's sake and to make a difference. And so we're very excited to share this. And as was said, this is the public launch of the index. And our ultimate goal was to look at how global change would affect the trade system. Now, along the way, we've done three things. We developed an index, which was a complicated mathematics and conceptual framework. We then looked at history to see what we could learn from that, and then we modeled scenarios of the future. So today we're going to learn a brief bit about the methodology of the index, but focus on what we've learned about history, and then do a little teaser for in the fall when we bring out what this means for climate change and global change impacts. As we pointed out, we had an incredible team. We feel we're standing on the shoulders of many. And we brought together a team that had been thinking on these different areas. And again, in a great Hegelian way, we brought a synthesis together. We had IFPRI that was doing modeling. And what J-WAFS and what Fact Alliance was about was bringing people together with skills to be what's really truly interdisciplinary and bringing these people together. And this is a list of the major people who have applied. And as one, we also had, as you've heard Nada speak so elegantly, it's very seldom you get the funder to be a partner of you and get their hands dirty on the work. So Nada and Hala who are here, but also Nate and Nat and Tim contributed directly to the website and the intellectual part of this work. So we're really thankful to have them support us. As you heard, Nada stole half of my intro, so I'm going to jump ahead. But basically, since 1995, there's been a six-fold increase in global trade related to the Doha agreement. And you can see that these flows are going all around. There are major exporters, major importers, minor exporters moving around, but there is a global system that's incredibly fragile. And what we want to look at that is, what is the role that this trade plays in food security? So our ultimate goal is about poverty alleviation, hunger reduction, and food security. But we wanted to look at what is the role of trade and how might that be impacted by climate change and global change. Food trade is incredibly vulnerable. And we have a hypothesis that food trade can improve food security. We'll see if you agree with me on that at the end. But the food trade system is very susceptible to shocks. Those shocks are wars like the Russian-Ukraine conflict. And then we have in our room, I don't know if you know, that Greg is also a prophet, because as we were putting this together, he said, Ken, we have to add maritime choke points as a threat. And the next week, the Evergreen got stuck in the Suez Canal. So this is a picture of that. That blocked all the trade to the Gulf regions from Europe and much of the United States by this activity. And we can see the Bosphorus being a similar choke point. But then when we tried to look at this, we were stuck. We looked around. There was no existing index. So we had to pull our
our heads together. And I wanted to thank someone who couldn't be here today, but an important part was Professor Jim Hall, who's a Martin Fellow and co-leader of the Systemic Resilience Project, coming together to say, how could we come up with the mathematics to do it? So this is the only equation you're going to see today, and this is our nerdiness. But what we did here is we built this framework where we took variables, and all these variables exist now from the data sets of FAO, ComStat, which is UN, and the Harvard Atlas for Economic Complexity. And we brought those and grabbed those about the 8 crops that we're looking. The major, what we're doing here is the major cereals and oils as well. So we come up with these indicators where we collect this data, and then we come up and make what we call the meta indicators. And so there are 5 key areas that we have identified that are important to food trade vulnerability. The first is import dependency, and that's what percentage of your food is imported. The next one, as Nader pointed out with his great anecdote, is feed dependency. So for example, Saudi Arabia is very self-sufficient in meat, but they're not self-sufficient in the feed. So it has to come in, and the same thing in Lebanon. So where's this food coming? It may be coming for humans, or it may be coming to feed. Then he brought up the other thing that was really important, and that's foreign exchange. If you want to import food, you have to pay for it. And we're going to see that a little bit later when we talk about the BRICS and how important foreign exchange can be there. Then the other 2 things is, how reliable is your supply chain? So if you're growing, if you're getting food from a country that has irrigation or very good rainfall, it's very stable. But if you're in a country with lots of droughts and floods, how stable is that supply? So that we look at. And then finally, we call it the supply chain robustness. And we'll hear from the panel, Egypt was importing over 60% of its wheat from 2 countries, Ukraine and Russia. So when the conflict happened, they had to scurry to try and replace that. So those are the 5 key areas that we see. And then what we did is we took these meta indicators, and then we have with us today 2 of our exciting MIT recent graduate, Mauricio, who helped with getting all the data that we needed. And then we have Jensen, who worked on the mathematics of this equation, but we did what's called a geometric measure. And the thing about a geometric measure is why it's not additive is you can't balance things. So if you think of a human, if you have a low blood pressure and 5 other good things, you're not healthy. If you have 4 or 5 medium level things, you're not healthy. So with what this says, it leans you towards giving you a higher vulnerability if you have medium areas. So we're trying to make the error that we want to be vulnerable if there's a risk of this happening to you. Now, that's the last we're going to say about methods. If you have any question during the reception afterwards, or if you're online, we welcome all of you. You can send an email. If you go on to the website here, there's a place to email us, or you can find us. There's a working paper you can get, which explains all the details, and there's many more equations if you get excited about those things. Now, when we looked at the Jameel Index and we got together and said, what is the philosophy of our phase 1 development? So drawing on British culture, we said, is this going to be a Freddie Mercury or a Mick Jagger index? If it was Freddie Mercury, what he said is, I want it all and I want it now. If it was Mick Jagger, you can't always get what you want, but if you try, you might find you get what you need. So what we decided is we're going with Mick Jagger. And the point is, this is the perfect index now. It's the phase 1. We only have 8 crops. It needs to be expanded. Their nutrition is done in a way that's 30 years old, but simple and transparent. So we wanted to just get it right where it was. And so methodologically, there can be improvements, but it's good enough. We can do something with it. You know, we hear sometimes that the best is the enemy of the good. And that's what we want to do. We want to get something out. Nader said, you can't go 6 years. You got to be done in 3. So we have 1 more month to finish things. So this is what we wanted to do as we went along. So the first question is, All right, let's look. What did we find? So now we're going to talk about our findings. This is the globe from 2019, and there's this ugly thing called COVID, which messed up all of our time series data, trying to understand what happened from 2019 to 2024. And the FAO, which is a wonderful body, is still 2.5 years late on publishing their data. And you can ask Mauricio about the unevenness of the data and why we had to use 3 data sets. But this is a rough idea of what it is. So let's take a look at this. You know, visual is nice. They say it's worth 1,000 words, but what does it mean? Well, when we look at this, we see that most of the world by population is very low in food trade vulnerability. However, food trade is not an individual's activity. And as Nutter pointed out, food trade is related to foreign exchange. It's related to trade, and those are country level, national level policies and institutions. So what we wanted to look at, the scope of this problem for the world is countries. So the rest of our work here, we're going to talk about percentage of countries. So if we look at that, while 72% of things, if you get China and India as very low, you get most of the world right there. So let's look at this. And as we'll see, and we're so fortunate to have Mihaela Papa here, who is a political scientist talking about governments. 35% of the world is very low. But importantly, look, it's almost 50% of the world is medium, high, or extreme. That's a serious issue with the relationship of food security and trade. So this is the overall picture. But what I want to know is who is. Let's see. Did hers get in the middle? Somehow, okay. Let me fix this for you. Okay, so I'll be telling you what's going on here. So the other thing is talk about tap. So, but one of the important things is that we look at this is who is vulnerable, and then where are they vulnerable? We want to take a look at that in this analysis. And then one of the things we won't see today is that as part of the Jameel Index, we have a deep dive. And right now we have 2 case study countries, Ethiopia and Malawi. And as part of this, the insistence in a good way is Community Jameel wanted to see global, regional, and national impacts. And so we're working with researchers at the Ethiopian Institute for Agricultural Research and 2 institutes in Malawi to be looking at deep dives at the country level, seeing what this means and looking not only at one of the questions of at the country level, the impact, what the different groups, rural versus urban, are being impacted that, and then we're also training them with capacity building so they can go and share the techniques with other countries themselves and do that training.
And I just need to share my screen. Hold on. Thanks, kind of.
So that part of this activity, what we're doing now is we have in the first part of the modeling, which is using the increased impact food model. So we want to know what's going to happen in the future. So we have scenarios where we're basing things using the IPCC, SSP scenarios for growth and different climate models, and that's what we're doing by the end of the summer. And perfect.
Here we are.
There we go.
We're going to leave the thing on the top for now.
Okay, no problem. So we continue. So what this is a stylized, we call these a kernel, and we're looking at the red line are the low income countries, and where do they fit along the Jameel score? So you see they're skewed towards the low end. So this was something that was a surprise to us. And as a modeler, what I really like is when things are counterintuitive. I came in and showed this to Greg, and he said, "What?" And I said, "What? Why are the low?" We thought these would be the most vulnerable, and we'll see that story. And then we see the high income, they're the next level, and then the middle income, lower and higher, they're sort of middle, but they span kind of evenly the entire Jameel. So they're risk over this broad area. And what did this mean? Well, we started looking at this, and if you see, in the low countries, they're only about 25% of the low income countries, which makes up 7% of the world's population, is at medium or high. But where you see the big one here is in the upper middle, where almost 60% of the country, 60% of the countries there are medium or high. But when we look at these numbers over here, look at the per capita availability of calories. So this is a rough number. It's like how many calories in the country divided by the people. Doesn't mean everybody's getting them right for the Gini coefficient. But it's at 2,300 here, where the high incomes have 33,488. But then you look at the per capita income in each of these. And so how is this affecting food security? How is trade impacting that? So we wanted to go deeper and look at that. The next thing we did is let's take a look at by country, by region, and these are the UN regions. And we see the largest one is Latin America and the Caribbean, because one of the things we've seen is island countries are basically huge food importers. So when we use it, they're small population, but there are a lot of small islands in the Caribbean, and so that pushes this out this way because it's percentage of countries. Then you see Oceania, because that's got a lot of little countries as well. But then you see Europe, North America, Canada, US, and Mexico. And then you see Asia sort of in the middle, and Africa again, which is hiding under the stop sharing. Africa's over towards this blue darker line, over towards the lower end. So Linus is here, Africa, don't worry about food vulnerability. But then we have to look. So we're getting this understanding of who's vulnerable, but how does that fit with food security? So you can see Africa, almost 50%, over 50% is very low or low. And as we've gone to see this distribution. The other thing we see is there's quite a bit of dynamics from year to year. And so this is affected by floods and droughts in countries. So it's weather. So what's happening in a country? Can they get access to food by buying it? Do they have the supply chains? What if there was a drought in the country that was supplying it? So we see for Afghanistan there, it has a range of about 30 points in the Jameel score. They go three ranges, three classifications from medium to extreme as we go there. We look at the other country on this side, which is Armenia, which is hiding under there. And Armenia moves around 20 points, but it stays in the high level. So it's one of the dangers of classification. But if you put numbers, a lot of policymakers don't want a number. What does it mean? They want the classification. So that's part of that framework of, we've had over 30 reviewers helping us deal with how to do this. We now look at Botswana, which has high imports, and they're extreme, but they stay extreme the whole time. And then finally, we see Ghana, and Ghana is self-sufficient and just varies a little bit because they have a stable climate in that area. How will climate change impact? How will this be changed by global change? Well, what we really care about is food security. And the metric we use after talking with Will Masters from the Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition is a method that's been out a while and then recently published by Will in a group, which is called the percentage of the population that can afford a healthy diet. So again, this is a composite index because what's in the diet, but calories aren't that good because, are they carbs? Are they proteins? Do you have micronutrients in it? So this is a breadbasket of the diet they should have. And then how expensive is that diet? And how likely are the people to have this food? So this was the recommended metric that we use. And if you look at it, we see almost the opposite picture we saw before. So while before the low-income countries were very low on the Jameel, they're very weak on food self-sufficiency. So, and then we look at the high-income countries, which had quite a bit of Jameel countries, and we look, almost 82% of them are good or very good. So, what is this saying? Where does trade fit into this dialogue? Well, this is a slide we put together where this is the Jameel score along the bottom. And the higher the Jameel score, the more vulnerable you are. So you don't want to be out to the right-hand side. That's bad. And then along the other side is the food security index. And that's the percentage of your population that can eat a healthy diet. And if we look at this from a income point of view, you can see that the low-income countries are down in this lower quadrant, where very low Jameel score, but very poor food security. We then look up and we see that there is low Jameel score and very high, and we see up in that quadrant, we see upper, middle, and the high income. But then we look on the other side with very high Jameel scores, and we see high income, middle income, and a few lower middle income. And so they have very high security. So we set back, what's going on here? So we started to look at this, and our hypothesis was, and we're going to see if you agree with our proof, is that you saw before the average income in the lower income is $700 per capita per year. The high income's over 40,000. They have the ability to buy the food. Now, one of the things was we were looking at that is, so you may have a country that has a lot of income, but what's important is that this path you took here was self-sufficiency. You're providing your own food. But this path to food security is through imports. So if you're Singapore, you're food secure, but you import your food. So as we go through this, what is the path as we're trying to provide policy for these low income and lower middle income? How do we get more food secure? There isn't a single way to do it. And what we need to be doing is looking at the assets of your country and knowing how to progress. So the question is what are the things that really drive you to get to this thing? And we took another look and said, and this is related to what Nader had talked about earlier. We went and looked at this issue of the bottom axis here is food production per capita. So how much you can produce in your country. You see the huge range of that you can go along the bottom. And then on the other axis is exports per capita. So the question is, the foreign exchange is so important. You have to be able to buy the food. And recently, Ethiopia was in a bind because of sanctions. They wouldn't be allowed to buy food. And they couldn't sell their exports, so they didn't have money. And so we see when we try to punish countries for poor behavior, we put embargoes on things. So the ability to export and get foreign exchange is crucial. And if we look at this now, and here's our low-income countries, they're on the very low side of food production, and they're also on the very low side of exports. We look at our high income, they span the whole range from a lot of food to not a lot of food, like the US does very well, and also, well, in Europe's there, but they've got a lot of exports, so they can afford it. Now, if we take a look here to our original diagram and bring it into food security in Jameel, we look at the mapping. So you see this group that has high exports and they span the range. We see they're food secure, and they don't have to worry about Jameel so much because they have the money to import that food. But half of them in this upper quadrant are now vulnerable to something that can affect the food chain. We then see here the lower incomes, and they map again to this region. So our hypothesis, we think, when we're trying to document this in even a stronger way, is that your ability to import through the ability of economic growth may be the way for some countries to grow and to be food secure. Now, this is the major finding of what we've seen from history as we looked at this, a lot more data that can happen. But one of the things we wanted to show you is what is the potential impact on this of global change? And that's including development and climate change. So these are three of the indicators that we use. And we're taking a look at this. The black lines in each of these, maize, rice, and wheat, are 2020, the food dependency ratio. So the lower the food dependency ratio, the more you're producing yourself. And this is the range over 188 countries in the world. Where does it look? So we see rice. A lot of countries are importing rice because they like rice. but they don't import it. They don't grow it, so they have to import it. Wheat is the same for many countries in the world. We have dominant exporters of wheat, but maize has grown significantly, particularly in Africa and other places. We then see the green in 2050, and that's what's happening because of both population and economic growth in your regions. And we see for rice and wheat, there's sort of the same amount of countries, and it looks pretty much the same. There's a little bit on the tails we lose, but there's a significant shift in maize, that there's a lot more countries that are now have higher import dependency ratios. Then if we look at climate change, we see that there's a shifting out to the right. So things are getting worse under maize. Rice and wheat, we increase that mode a little bit. So it's not that dramatic, but maize is really dramatic. And we went in, so we're just going through that data now, but we wanted to take a quick look. And this is what's in the SSP3 scenario, is a big push for biofuels. So that biofuels is taking the land away from food. So we have fuel or food, clean energy or food. And this is something we really have to look at, as what is going to be the impact of using agriculture and land to fight the climate battle. And on some of the other work that's been going on to get to net zero is taking land in Africa and Latin America out of production to do climate change. So what's the ability of this tool? Why we think it's useful? We think it can generate new knowledge. We want to train people to use it. We want to get it in people's hands. And one of the exciting things, Community Jameel wants to make sure that this is accessible, and they're supporting the maintenance and the hosting of the machine with some of the top professionals out there, Tim and Nat. But also, it's already being used. And what's really exciting is last week, I was on a Zoom call at 3 in the morning in Colorado with the World Bank and the government of Chad. And we've been just part of these things called the Country Climate Development Reports. And over 140 have already been finished on this. But for Chad, they were part of a Sahel regional one. They asked for a deep dive, an extension of the CCDR in food security, and they are using the Jameel Index. This work is currently going on. You can see Chad there, and we're discussing what's the path that Chad should take to try to increase its food self-sufficiency, and they're using the tool in their analysis right now. So policy relevant activities currently going on. What are our emerging findings? Just quickly, 49% of the nations in the world are medium to high vulnerability. There's year-to-year variability that goes on that is happening because of climate and other things. Low vulnerability and lower middle income is due to the inability to import. We see the regions that are highly vulnerable. And then the thing that we'll know a little bit more in the future is global and climate change has the potential to have major impacts. And in some ways, the population and economic development is going to be a stronger threat than even climate change overall, but in certain regions it's going to be specific. So that's why we're looking at this. This work that you've seen today is being written up. It's in preparation now. Greg and I are putting that together, and that will be available soon as we put that. So what are the next steps? Climate change rollout. We're looking at doing mission-specific applications, like developing a desktop, a dashboard, say, just for Africa, just for Latin America, or for certain needs. Extending the meta indicators to do nutrition better and sustainability. Those are two things we know we should do. But then doing these national deep dives in capacity building, that we see there's a lot more option and opportunities for that. So thank you very much.
Bear with me while I go back to the other slide deck, folks. This is it, right? Okay. Just have to go back and share it. Oops. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Ken. It's exciting to see this getting out there. I've worked with you on it for the last 3 years and the rest of the team. I'm pleased now to introduce Dr. Mihaela Papa. She's the Director of Research and Principal Research Scientist at the Center for International Studies at MIT, where she leads the BRICS Lab. An expert in negotiation strategy and coalition building, she developed the BRICS Convergence Index and has published on BRICS-US relations as well as the group's de-dollarization and climate initiatives. Mihaela?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I would like to thank our distinguished host. I would like to thank our index team for including me and the Community Jameel. So I would like to talk today about food trade in the age of uncertainty. And in 3 weeks, we have a BRICS summit, which is a major international relations geopolitical event. And the big question for the summit is, can BRICS shape the global landscape? And here, of course, President Lula is welcoming all of different leaders, not only from the BRICS countries, the core group, but also like the extended BRICS, Friends of BRICS and BRICS Plus system. So, on the slide. All right, I have it. So, but to start us off, BRICS as a group and food are intertwined from the very start of the BRICS collaboration. When it started in 2009 as BRIC group, like 4 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the first time the leaders met, they produced 2 major documents. One document was joint statement of the BRICS countries' leaders that said, yes, we are going to cooperate on so many different things. But then another one was the joint statement on global food safety. And even when all of these different countries joined, the agriculture agenda stayed very relevant. So when I'm talking about BRICS, I'm talking about BRICS 2023 as the core 5 members, because there have been a lot of changes. And then BRICS 2025, I'm talking about the new members, because the 5 core members also have undergone 2 expansions. So the entity has been expanded in 2024 and 2025. So these are the new full members and these are the partners. So when I'm talking about BRICS 2024, I'm referring to the newcomers. So what I would like to do today is give you a flavor, like a preliminary flavor of how the Jameel Index can apply and can speak to some of the most relevant debates in current geopolitics and international relations. So one debate that we have seen is BRICS is almost like a movement by now, because we have seen a lot of countries wanting to join and being on the wait list to join. But it's not really clear what is there, what are the actual economic benefits, and to what extent are these membership benefits linked to trade or trade prospects or trade promises. Then the second geopolitical debate is a question of broader alignment that BRICS brings along. So there is a lot of talk about de-dollarization. One can also say diversification of the currency each country uses, but also the larger move away from the dollar and what it means. And also the question of regional realignments. So BRICS is trans-regional, but its ambition is also to integrate more within regions. So finally, there is the question of collective action, where we stand right now at the international level in terms of addressing food insecurity, in terms of trade multilateralism in particular. With that in mind, looking at food and agriculture, this is one of the high policy convergence areas that comes up in our BRICS Convergence Index. It's an area that has an extensive cooperation infrastructure, working groups, there's agricultural research platform. But what's really important right now is that Brazil's presidency has an opportunity to set the agenda moving forward. And there is this joint declaration on agriculture that looks at also the action plan and the economic partnership strategy that's being renewed. So basically, there is effort on the food angle, on the food side, and on the trade side, and at the same time, a very specific proposal for working together on BRICS grain exchange, and that's supposed to facilitate trade and enable BRICS to trade grain, especially focused on basic, like primary staples, wheat, rice, and maize. And it was endorsed in 2024 Kazan Declaration. And of course, now it's a question, what will be implemented, how, when, and so on. I wanted to give you a flavor of how Jameel Index speaks to this topic. So for example, you can here see wheat exports and imports. So when we think about the economic benefits and what exactly are the new members potentially getting, first of all, we can look at the old members. So the old members reached 2023, you can see actually 2010, like this is the time of start of cooperation, the volume of wheat exports has increased, and of course Russia is a big driver here. But then here, when you start looking at BRICS 2025, what are the new members and who they are, you can see that they are really like big importers. So there is a very clear complementarity here in the wheat context. And when you want to disaggregate this, you can look at exactly where the wheat exports are going and where, like, especially like here, exports on one side, imports on another. So you can actually map out and see what are the actual trade flows. With maize, you have basically a similar picture here with an increase in maize exports in the core BRICS, and then potential opportunity and complementarity with these new members and partners, and basically the ability to use some of these markets and to strengthen BRICS grain exchange and collaboration. Maize is actually, when we look at here, particularly scalable for strengthening BRICS internal trade. As you see, the exports are continuously growing, and there is a lot of opportunity to scale here. Then when we look at rice, and of course you can see here, like with maize, it's Brazil. With rice, it's the question of India being an important driver in exports. So rice also shows the growth in exports of all BRICS volumes. And then here also the question of how the new countries play along. So with rice, there's also another story that we can see, even if we want to look at not only like BRICS trade and what is its potential, but also how BRICS relates to the global south. So here, and if you look at this like line from BRICS 2023 to Africa, it's getting stronger year by year. And that gives you a story of potentially thinking about BRICS and BRICS Plus collaboration and what BRICS can do in terms of increasing African trade. So to look at the second type of application, here are the potential new champions of BRICS grain exchange. So if we look at two indicators from the data that was presented, the food import dependence and foreign exchange constraints, it's very easy to identify which countries are most vulnerable. And then you can also see that some of these countries specifically wanted to advance agricultural issues through BRICS, and that was what BRICS found. That's why they found BRICS appealing. So finally, the final example in terms of regional realignments, a big story for BRICS was engaging with regions, like how can ASEAN, for example, be interested in greater collaboration, how to attract members from the ASEAN. And if we look at last year and a half, these are the new members and partners, there was a big interest from ASEAN in collaboration. Food has been seen as neutral, as an entry point into regions. And there are a lot of prospects for BRICS ASEAN cooperation, especially when thinking about reserves and food security. This also has multilateral implications. To what extent this can actually spill over to other areas of collaboration and strengthening the BRICS ASEAN connection. Finally, where does this leave us? As we're thinking about the future of the international system, are we going to see, following the BRICS path and following the current developments, a reformed, development-centered international system where BRICS actually helps energize these like traditional global agendas, SDG agendas, in the absence of the hegemon? Or are we going to see more of a BRICS-driven new system that's built around new international infrastructure for BRICS and the global south, and can it bring greater polarization? The ultimate test for any system is how it treats the most vulnerable. And where I see the greatest potential for the Jameel Index is that it helps identify both the trends and the needs and protect the most vulnerable. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Mihaela. So Mihaela and Ken, you can go up to the stage, and I'll introduce each of the other panelists, and we can turn off the screen here. So welcome. We'll start at the far end. Dr. Rehab. Oh, nope. No, that's good. It's good. Dr. Linus Mofor is the Regional Advisor for Sustainability and Climate for Eastern and Southern Africa with UNICEF's regional office in Nairobi. Before joining UNICEF in December 2024, Linus was a Senior Environmental Affairs Officer at the African Climate Policy Center of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, which he joined after his role as an analyst in the International Renewable Energy Agency. I'm sorry, Linus. I've actually said this before too. So before that, Linus worked with UNIDO and was an academia in the UK for many years. After Linus, next in line, we've got Dr. Rehab Osman, who is the subject coordinator for all economics programs at Oxford Brookes University and is a quantitative policy-oriented economist. Her research covers areas such as natural resources and ecological economics, climate change and environment, agricultural and development, food security, energy policy, as well as trade and regional integration. Paula de Almeida is the head of Pegasus Capital Advisors Food and Agriculture Water Practice, a private investment firm leading investments in the Global South with funds accredited with the Green Climate Fund. She joined Pegasus from the food industry, having served as Chief Innovation Officer and a variety of leadership roles for Mars Incorporated, a global food and pet care company. So I'm very pleased to welcome the panel. I'm going to join you guys at the end over there so we can be more casual. There's microphones for everyone to use. So, Mihaela, I'm going to start building off of your presentation. How central is food to the growth of BRICS? You know, obviously we're focused on it here because of the Jameel Index, but is it actually a core driver from your research in the growth of the BRICS?
Thank you. So the question is always like, when you bring different countries together, how can they work together and find mutual gains? And agriculture was one of the areas where they actually found themselves, and from the very start of collaboration. And if it wasn't for agriculture and the strength of agriculture, like the spillover effects to increase collaboration would be much different. It's crucial now, especially for Brazil and agenda moving forward, because it connects all of these different aspects, like how do you do development at the center, sustainable development goals connection, technical cooperation, South-South cooperation. So it hits all of these different boxes of the system that BRICS are trying to shape and form. So it's kind of like a good example. And at the same time, it has this strong aspect of human dignity and human security.
Thank you. So Rehab, you're from a BRICS member. You're from Egypt. So from your perspective, what are the key benefits for Egypt joining the BRICS?
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Community Jameel, for involving me in this very interesting discussion. Egypt, as we have heard from Ken and Mahila presentation, it's very interesting case study. And Egypt is experiencing very severe climate change condition. Egypt is one of the most water scarce countries and well beyond water poverty line. In terms of food security, Egypt is one of the largest wheat importer all over the globe. So Egypt every year consume 20 million tons of wheat. Less than half of this is produced domestically. So it means that Egypt imports around 10, 12 million tons a year. And as Ken mentioned, just before the war in Ukraine, 80% of that comes only from two countries, Russia and Ukraine. So what does that leave us? That leaves us with a country which is very food insecure and very vulnerable to trade shocks and climate change constraint, make expansion in food production domestically is almost impossible. So if Egypt wants to increase food security, the only way out is importing. And BRICS will provide Egypt more trade diversification, more trade and supply chain resilient sources of wheat and other imports and other crops, and also the current discussion about grain exchange and also relying on domestic currency will be really great benefits for Egypt from joining BRICS.
And how with that trade vulnerability, right, for Egypt, how could the Jameel Index be used as a tool to support that planning and deeper engagement with BRICS?
Yeah, Egypt will be a very interesting case study for deep diving using Jameel Index. As Ken mentioned in his presentation, Jameel Index will help us to measure vulnerability, to evaluate future scenarios. So we would like for Egypt to know, for the politician in Egypt and policymakers to know if joining BRICS is just moving risk from Western world to another region, or it is a buffer strategy against climate change and food insecurity. So we will really need to help nation planning and decision maker to know what exactly is the benefit from joining BRICS, and also to evaluate the future scenarios for climate change and any potential risk.
That's a really good observation. Is it actually diversifying the risk? Is it de-risking, or is it just spreading the risk to other locations? Right.
It is a very fair concern, and that is exactly where Jameel Index will help Egypt to know.
Thank you. Linus, we're still talking about policy, so I'm going to ask you a question. How could the Jameel Index support food security and policy and planning in Africa?
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Greg. Greetings. And let me thank Community Jameel for getting me involved in this project. And congratulations to the team. This is a wonderful tool. And I think I would want to fully agree with Professor Sir Charles when he said this tool provides a good policy framework that can influence how policy is made. And in Africa, of course, we know that it's a continent that is being impacted the most by climate change impacts with the least adaptive capacity. But we also know that it is a continent that in 2021 operationalized what we call the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So with this concept in mind and being able to have countries working together to see what the risks are based on the Jameel Index can help them now implement policies to facilitate the operationalization of that trade, because it means that if there are droughts, like often happens in Eastern Africa or Southern Africa, but with trade, you can have grains moving across the continent. Or as I said here about, like, say, if Egypt was having now to be caught by surprise with the constraints, with the effects of the crisis in Ukraine, then Ethiopia was producing more, maybe more could have come from Ethiopia. But then it is also a very good tool in the sense that if you're going to use then trade, the continental free trade as a way of ensuring food security, do we have the investments in the enabling environment? Do we have the investments in the infrastructure that will enable that to happen? Do we have the investments in the services and so on? And of course, that can also then help countries to say, this is something that can help us move forward using the trade, the AFCFTA, as a way of addressing food security, and therefore putting in place the policies that will make the investments happen so that we can achieve food security. And but at the same time, what is even more important is the fact that I think Neda mentioned nutrition outcomes, right? Because we know that stunting is a very big problem in Africa. Without food security, you cannot address the issue of stunting. And I always like to quote President Adesina, the outgoing president of the African Development Bank, who always says, stunted children lead to stunted economies. So I think using the Jameel Index as a policy tool to enable a regional agenda to address food security and therefore investment in the early development of the child, and therefore investments into the future economy is extremely important. So I think this is why this is really, really a good tool that can help address not only food sufficiency, but also the investment in human capital that is needed for Africa's transformation going forward.
Yeah, and as Ken pointed out too, in the next few months, we're going to introduce the climate change element, and with that comes the long-term policy and planning investments you need in the infrastructure, right? Because if Africa is going to increase regional trade to meet these goals, that's a long-term investment, and there's varying degrees of development and throughout those countries. If you're running transportation networks through those, you have to plan adequately for that. Paulo, you represent the private sector on this panel. So with the growing uncertainty in the global trade systems, what risks do you see, and how could the Jameel Index support planning and investment for the private sector?
So first of all, thank you again for the invitation to this panel. It's an honor to be here with such distinguished folks. Look, I think the index is very clear in its dynamic nature of illustrating some real pressure. I think your slide about the biofuel trade-offs in food systems, that was a killer slide. Something that we have been thinking of for quite some time within our portfolio of investments. And this kind of information is critical to help inform the right investments to make sure that we are addressing, to Linus's point, the foundational elements of food and ag systems within any one country, right? It's very easy to get enamored with very frontier technology solutions that sound very sexy on paper, when in many of these places, as the index has illustrated, what you need is just really basic infrastructure, right, to get the machinery flowing. With that in mind, though, you have to look at this kind of data to be able to de-risk that kind of investment, because infrastructure investment, for those of you that are not close to it, is very expensive to put in place, and it requires long-term commitment, rooting in a system that needs to be flanked with other infrastructure. It needs the policy to come along with it. And oftentimes, if you don't have one or two elements of that kind of investment, it can all fall apart. And investors don't want to hear about increased exposure for the money that needs to be invested in some of these structural changes that you need to see in many of these countries, despite most of the investors seeing the potential to be realized for some of this transformation to be to come to life. And so, for example, we talk often about the Global South, and our investment funds are all dedicated to the Global South. There is real belief that the Global South can leapfrog, and there's a lot of the data that even you illustrated with your BRICS information. It's very clear that with the right networks, the right trading partnerships, regional structures, they can create powerhouses in terms of economic development. They can circumvent this cycle of stunted economies that come from lacking of basic human foundational needs, such as food security. That's one of the risks that we see that we can bypass if we have the right information into the investments. The other piece too is that when we understand this kind of data and the kind of circumstances on the ground and the exposure that they have to trading partners or lack thereof, then we can understand what kind of exposure the investment itself has. And then you create mitigating mechanisms around it as you deploy the investment. And you flank that, whether it's insurance, whether it's blended finance instruments, whether it's different investment partners, creating the right finance capital stack to come around it. Sometimes what you need is catalytic investment to come in, create the groundwork for it. So these are all considerations that now allow for the finance community to start having the right conversation around how do we create resilience in the investments that are in place. And then lastly, I think just really critical that, you know, today we sit on a lot of data, and most ag and food systems that have been built around the world date back to the 1970s, right? It's a bit out of, it's not fit for purpose and not fit for context. And we have a lot of science and a lot of technology that has yet to been deployed in the right order. And so understanding this kind of data tells you how can you de-risk the deployment of some of that technology and information. And sometimes whether you need to lead with policy or you need to lead with pure play investment that will unlock the policy for the right conversations.
Thanks. Ken, you led us into the whole event with the keynote. So I just want to give you a chance to comment or have any reflections or have any questions for the panel that you may have that you've been thinking about as we put this together.
One of the things that we see, I'm going to ask you in the private sector, this hypothesis that the way to food security can be through imports, which means economic development. Do you see that as a valid approach? Because we see this food self-sufficiency versus food security, and with the way that there is embargoes being used by countries as weapons for political gain. Are we going to see that, or are we going to have food self-sufficiency driving things more than, you know, economic growth that I'm going to buy that? And the other thing that we see, and we're working on this, as we said, food self-sufficiency now tends to lead towards environmental degradation and non-sustainability. So how is that dynamic playing? And as an investor, would you say, you know, and I want to help food security, so I'm going to invest in data centers, or I'm going to invest in something else industrial?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if we go back to principles, without the basics, of which food security is one of them, nothing else sits on top, right? So economic development, et cetera. And when you have issues with water, food, access to health, education, and shelter, you start to see the fraying of that social fabric there. So the point you've been making for some time, Ken. I think this concept of food self-sufficiency is very peculiar, because even though you have agricultural powerhouses in the world, not everybody, very few of them can truly be self-sufficient for the long term. Exactly for the points that you're saying, that you might be able to have a runway for food self-sufficiency with agricultural distribution and rebalancing of your food baskets, but at what cost? And now we have a lot of science that's telling us that soil health and better regenerative practices for management of that production are critical to maintaining the longevity of your food production systems, especially agricultural systems. The other point too is, what kind of systems intervention are you doing from a food and agricultural system perspective within any one country, right? I have seen very few countries have the sophistication to be able to look at the totality of their own system and create the right trade-offs and decisions. And your graph on to biofuel or not to biofuel is very clear. I think the only one that has, out of the BRICS, frankly, that has been able to create some semblance of balance is Brazil, but that's just because they have massive amounts of land. They have natural prowess in scale agriculture. But if the world starts demanding much higher requirements for biofuels, they're typically quickly going to tip that balance. And we see some of that already happening in the system, and that kind of pressure. And so it's the responsibility of the private sector also to say, what are you incentivizing in the system? Because when I say yes to an investment, tens of millions of dollars in one area, I'm saying no to quite a few other things, right? And the question is, are those no's in the right order? And you know, we mentioned earlier the FAO folks and the analysis that we're doing. Last year, we were in a very insightful conversation with them where they said, look, we have a tendency to want to throw the kitchen sink at food, ag, and sustainable solutions to say we need to do everything everywhere all at the same time. And the answer is no, that's actually not the case. In some places, you need to have very comprehensive intervention, but in other cases, you need to be very precise in what you sequence so that the positive domino effect of change takes hold. And so that's also something that we think very deeply, especially in our investments. I don't know that that's true for every investor, but for our investors, it's very clear that we need to be very precise in how we deploy so that we are not incentivizing the wrong things in the system. But back to your point on food self-sufficiency, I'd welcome folks to have a very strong argument and a very laid out roadmap plan for intervention for any one country, including those that have very sophisticated agricultural systems, to talk about the success rate of the longevity of that plan. And I actually think it's going to be much more sophisticated and intelligent for them to create the right regional partners, as you've illustrated, so that from a BRICS standpoint, for example, which you saw some of the graphs, the better flow and the better dynamic nature of shifting gears when climate hits, when a war hits, when there's a serious political issue, you will be more agile in response that way.
Mahela, something that Paolo just said made me think about, do you see the BRICS as building greater resiliency in these food trade networks? I mean, there are members that have weathered various conflicts or crises. Do you see resilience in the system, or is it still kind of too early to tell on as it expands?
I think it's a case-by-case basis and grain by grain. So I think, I mean, like there was this whole wheat challenges in terms of when you saw one of the slides had a big drop in wheat volumes, and that was both due to Russia situation and the India situation during the heat wave. So you combine basically conflict and nature in basically destroying your resilience if you run out of exports. But then there are also some developments like rice diplomacy that India has been doing with Indonesia, and then potentially figuring out a new way to do rice diplomacy between BRICS and ASEAN. So that's where I see potential here.
And I want to give on rice. I want to give in India. I want to give a quick shout out to our colleague Ihab Father Othman, who recently published a paper on the impacts of India's export bans on rice. So it's out there if you're interested. I'm mindful of time. So yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry. No, just on this issue about resilience, and I want to take the opportunity to give a story about something that I hope can also help us to see this. When I was at UNIDO, we had a friend, a Sjur from Statoil, from Norway, on the 17th of May, which is the National Day. He invited me and my family. We spent the whole week with them. One evening, we were eating chicken, and I think I've told you this story before. And he said, oh, this chicken, we bought it in Sweden. I said, you bought it in Sweden? He said, yeah, because here in Norway it's very expensive. Then he said, but I'm sure it was supplied to Sweden from Denmark, and I'm sure it came to Denmark from Germany, and I'm even sure it was packaged in Poland. But the fact of the matter was that day, a child who wanted to eat chicken in Norway was able to eat it, because there was a resilient value chain, right? So one way to also look at this is to see how do we strengthen the regional value chains as a way of ensuring, because this value chain is resilient. And so you can be confident that in Norway you can get chicken that was packaged in Poland. But if you go to, say, Africa, in Kenya, you can, because you mentioned, Ken, that the import way of getting out of it, you can have the money to import, but is a value chain resilient to ensure that it can come? And in that sense, I want to take this opportunity to also Craig, that at UNICEF, we've developed something called the Climate Children Risk Index, which is basically looking at the exposure and vulnerability. And I think this tool, the Jameel Index, I would like to see if we can work together to see how we can bring in that dimension of food and therefore nutritional risks to add as a layer of that, so that we can have something that can better inform how we target social services for children. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to. I'm enjoying this conversation. I want to ask if any members of the audience have any questions, and I know we've probably got some online too, right, Jensen? Yes. Okay. So, any members of the audience in person have any questions for the panel? you could just introduce yourself. Would you?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Betts from Climate One. I've got a small question for Paola. Uh, so we know we need to improve food security. We also need to improve the nutritional profile of food, but we know we have a crisis in terms of soil health, which is massively depleted after 200 plus years of intensive or even if it's not intensive, perhaps in Africa, but it's heavily chemically induced agriculture, which has impoverished our soil. How are you planning to sort of reconcile these two things, helping to improve trade flows, obviously local, regional trade flows, to make the whole system more resilient, with the sort of soil health that is the only thing that will lead to food security? And are you planning or perhaps thinking of linking up with some of the really large investors like sovereign wealth funds, which are currently requesting disclosure on nature from their investee companies, like big food manufacturer, from cocoa to coffee, etc. So that's, small question for you.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a big question. I think we're already seeing most of our investors, we especially given our accreditation, we are a blended finance fund, and we know how to structure this kind of investment for the Global South. For 25 years, the company has been investing in sustainable development, taking bets on the frontiers, especially in places where many wouldn't take that investment. But you're absolutely right that you can't just incentivize, restoration, regeneration without the right models and the right techniques. And so, and there's enough evidence in the system right now at scale that regenerative agriculture does and will produce more than the current models, and is actually generating more return for the farmers in the long run if they can get to a certain threshold level in terms of scale. And so what we do is in our investments, and I know many others are following suit, there's very large peers of ours that only deploy large sums of capital for systems that are complete interventions with the right to science and technology. And I think that will become the norm and mainstream in terms of investments into the future. I think current mechanisms or current models of agricultural production don't have longevity in the system. However, with that said, there's a lot of scale and money tied to them today, and we will have to pivot that system over time. But your point on soil nutrition, and that's a depletion of a real asset, right, that will be diminishing in productivity over time. That's something that needs to be mitigated and addressed right now. And we've seen large swaths of land in China even now no longer productive for any type of production, let alone agriculture, given the amount of chemicals in the system.
So I think Ken's going to
yes,
refer to some of the online questions for us.
So we have two. One is for Rahab, which we also have to make a public announcement that as of August 1st, she's going to become the head of the Department of Economics at Oxford Brookes University. So Mabruk.
Thank you.
So I want something that blends the whole panel, this question. So I'm modifying a little bit. Something that means water, food, energy, and politics. In the BRICS, we find out now that Ethiopia and Egypt both joined in the next round. We have all been involved, some of us in the Martin School has been involved funding work on transboundary national resources, and Jim Hall and Kevin Wheeler, and we were in this room talking about the GERD and that. Do you see this as a breakthrough for potential cooperation between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, particularly, but Egypt and Ethiopia, or is it just going to be a distraction, and the Nile will still be in the way? And, how could that help through the BRICS?
Thanks a lot, Ken, for that very, very interesting question. Absolutely, I agree that Egypt joining the BRICS and coincidentally with Ethiopia is great chance for the two countries to cooperate rather than to have that conflict over Nile water. So in Egypt, the situation is very complicated. Food security is not just a social good. it has lots of political and social implication, and we saw that back in the revolution in 2011. So increasing food price caused lots of and huge political disruption, and can lead to political instability. Plus, GERD also increase lots of like public disapproval about the political agenda and what the politicians are doing and why we are giving up Nile water and how we will face even more water scarcity in the middle of all the climate change constraints that Egypt is experiencing. So I do believe that Egypt and Ethiopia joining BRICS open doors for both countries to collaborate and to move beyond the conflict to more win-win situation. So BRICS hopefully will provide multi-layered strategic response to food security for both countries. Specifically for Egypt. Egypt is a very interesting case study, as I have mentioned, and over 70 million Egyptians depend on subsidized food, which is funded from a government program. And with constraint on foreign exchange, with all the political conflict and unrest happening in the Middle East, which will add another layer of availability of foreign exchange and resilience of food supply chains. So joining BRICS is not just a geopolitical transformation from one side of the global food exporters to another side. I believe that it is very interesting and very important strategic structural change that Egypt can pursue in order for Egypt to go beyond food insecurity, conflict, water resilience, and water scarcity. So as you mentioned in one of your graphs, there are two ways to ensure food security: self-sufficiency and import. Self-sufficiency is almost impossible for a large population country like Egypt. So collaborating with African partner, Ethiopia in particular, and Sudan, with whom we share the Nile water, and shifting from being very concentrated on two countries, Ukraine and Russia, to more diversified trade supply chains will be very beneficial for the country. Thanks,
Shukran.
Ken.
You want to take one
Thank you.
local?
Yeah, we've got
one
Cheryl
online.
has a question. Then we can go Cheryl, and then in the back, and then we'll go to one more online. I think that'll
Yes.
probably bring us to the end.
Thank you. Fantastic work and really exciting insights that you've given. One of the questions I would have, and perhaps you can throw into the pot if you focus more on BRICS, is that I love Anna and Will's affordability index. If you're working on the cost of a healthy diet, you're eliminating most African populations because the number of people in Africa who can afford the healthy diet, they actually have 3 different indexes that you might consider using. But also a question around how that data will feed in future, because most demographic household surveys are funded by agencies that are in the great disinvestment in nutrition at the moment. They're only done every 5 years. And also, if you think of the base for that index, it's based on countries that have food-based dietary guidelines. There are only 9 of those in Africa, and I would guess your list of the broader BRICS interest groups probably don't have that data available. So just some things, we need more better and more up-to-date nutrition data. COVID caused a glitch in many of those, and the current disinvestment in nutrition will do so even more. So just something to consider.
Yeah, thanks. We actually, as we were looking for a single indicator for food security, which we fully understand is itself a composite index. So we've talked about this extensively, and planning on engaging with some of our broader community through FACT to actually address that as we move forward. But thank you for that insight. It is a difficult indicator to try to, or set of indicators to try to work in. and very, very good points. We had a question in back, and then we'll go to online.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Precious, and I'm visiting from the Netherlands, Wageningen University. My question is particularly the crops. You're using mainly commodity crops, and I was wondering what the impact of that in your modeling is, because yeah, the type of crops that you're using, and talking about nutrition and overall the diet.
So the question is, why did we focus on ultimately the crops we did, largely commodity crops, and leave others out? Also, we could. Do you want to take that one, or you want me to?
It's the Mick Jagger approach. Also, and those are the primary trade that was affecting nutrition. I mean, the micronutrients are there and some of the others, but this was the primary group that we could get. And we can talk to Mauricio. We just had a hard time even getting some of those data for some of the countries, trying to get detailed data on, some of the others were really difficult. So it sort of was the first step. And then what we're hoping, as we said, is if we work with people who have a certain mission, if they're looking at avocados or they want to look at fruits or whatever, that would be something we'd have to marshal our thoughts and to use for that. The other thing, Cheryl, is that one of the things we're hoping to do as we build a platform is have plug and play. So if you go on the index now, the 5 meta indicators, you can customize your own index. You can change the weights, make it be 0, 1, 2, or 3. And so you can say, I really care about foreign exchange, and make that 3 in the others, and you'll get a new ranking. We're looking at switching, like using the simple IFPRI people at risk of hunger rather than the dietary one. But we as working with others felt this was a good one, because we have to use an indicator that the models can produce an output for. So that sometimes with scenario. So if we're assuming a reduction in the Gini coefficient, because we're getting GDP growth, those would be assumptions we make. So as we move forward, giving more bells and whistles for a user. But we do have a nice question. I'm going to read it, and then I think it's for everybody. And Greg, you will have to police this.
Okay. We've got can go on for about 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay. The panel talked about foreign exchange as something important for food security, but also highlighted the growing volume of agricultural land use for non-food. Presumably, these play a role in reducing imports, energy, or B, increasing imports, and would increase the availability of foreign exchange. Do you have any hypotheses or conclusions on the trade-off between food and non-food use in agricultural lands?
All right, who wants to take that one first? Do we have any takers?
I'm going to ask Paula for Brazil, and then ask Linus for Africa, and then Mahela to talk about the political, can we implement those on sovereign countries? 30 seconds each.
Yeah, so I think if we look at Brazil, Brazil has been one of those countries that has managed to, in the long term, properly, I'd say in quote unquote, properly balance the allocations of biofuels and mainstream food production. It's a global supplier of food staples, but also has significant production of ethanol. The only concern I have is the pressure in the system. Once you have bigger demand for biofuels, what will that do long term? But I think for now, Brazil has been one that has been managing it at scale. Let's just put it that way. But obviously, I think from a policy standpoint, Mahela, you'll have a different perspective on how that plays out.
Linus, you cover all sectors. You're at UNIDO, industry, arena with energy, and now food and caring about stunting in children. What's the African response to that?
No, of course you cannot, food availability of food security has to come first, because energy is a big spectrum of things, right? So you cannot then say bioenergy is so important that you have to sacrifice food. But I think, I don't have the data, but I'm just thinking that there's not much biofuel production in Africa where there's that competition. But I'm just wondering whether the challenge might be that if there is a demand for grains from countries who want to import the grains as feedstock for their biofuels, where therefore the production in Africa is selling there because it's better value than for food, then that will be where the challenge is. But in terms of actually production locally, I don't think it's a big issue. But the big issue might be that there's more opportunity for people to just export directly to countries that want to buy the grains as feedstock for biofuels. But when I hear from African policy makers, food security is primary number one objective.
Mahela, do you think that there's an institutional way for this balance, or it's going to be driven by the market or local sovereignty?
So I think the big challenge in BRICS was that climate wasn't really the central part of the agenda. So you had agriculture agenda and then a little bit of climate in it and energy agenda. So there was not a holistic approach. And this is changing now with Brazil being in charge this year. Actually, Brazil is the one bringing in climate as like front and center in connection with these other topics. So I think if you have different institutional processes and they do not necessarily intersect, it's very hard to bring all of these trade-offs together so that the same people who care about all of them are in the room, rather than like having each in their own turf.
Yeah, if you allow me only 10 seconds. I would like to close up with saying that food security today is shaped not only by what a country grows, but by with whom the country is trading and the trade agreement condition and the geopolitical context. Why I'm saying that? Because historically, Egypt was known as a grain basket for the whole region. And you all know about like Egyptian cotton, and Egypt historically used to export lots of rice. And now we see Egypt in a very vulnerable situation, and Jameel Index is placed in one of the highest vulnerability brands. So that leaves us with food security today is very important, and countries should look at with whom they trade and trade conditions, and BRICS open up doors for countries to move away from food insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are out of time. So I want to thank our speakers and our panelists for a wonderful event. Time went by way too fast. And thank you to Community Jameel for supporting this important work. And that Ken provided the contact information for us, so you can reach out to us that way. And see you next time.
And I'd just like to intervene. I'd like to thank you as a great moderator and host. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.